Right now, somewhere under the mountains of Fiordland, New Zealand, rock that has been locked and grinding for decades just let go. A magnitude 5.9 earthquake tore through one of the most geologically violent corners of the planet, about 42 kilometers northwest of the small town of Teanau. And if you don't know why that location should make a seismologist's stomach drop, stick with me for the next few minutes, because this is not just another earthquake. This is a shake happening directly on top of the intersection between two of the most dangerous fault systems in the southern hemisphere. Drop a comment right now and tell me if you've ever felt a quake like this. Furniture sliding, windows rattling, that split second where your brain doesn't know if it's a truck outside or something much worse. I read every single one of those comments, especially from people in Aotearoa. If you want to be the first to know every time the ground moves somewhere that matters, subscribe right now, it's free. And let's push this one to 5,000 likes so the people who need this information actually see it. Okay, let's get into what actually happened. On the morning of June 20th, 2026, local time, GeoNet and the USGS both confirmed a magnitude 5.9 earthquake originating roughly 76 kilometers beneath the surface, northwest of Teanau in the New Zealand South Island. Within minutes, GeoNet's Felt Report system was lighting up across the lower South Island, Queenstown, Invercargill, Gore, all the way up into Dunedin and out toward the west coast. Authorities briefly urged some coastal and low-lying communities near the fjords to move to higher ground as a precaution, while officials evaluated the shaking, though a tsunami warning was never formally issued for this particular event. That instruction alone should tell you something. When New Zealand's emergency management system tells people near the coast to get to elevated ground before they've even finished confirming the details, that is not bureaucratic overcaution. That is a country that has learned, the hard way, exactly what this stretch of coastline is capable of producing. So let's talk about where this actually happened, because location is doing almost all of the work in this story. Fiordland sits at the southwestern tip of New Zealand's South Island, and underneath it runs the Poisagur subduction zone, a section of plate boundary where the Australian plate is being forced down and under the Pacific plate. A few hundred kilometers to the north, that same plate boundary transitions into something completely different in character. The Alpine Fault, a massive strike-slip fault that runs almost the entire length of the South Island. Roughly 600 kilometers of continuous rupture potential. Fiordland is essentially the hinge point, the geological seam, where a subduction zone grinds directly into a transform fault. And hinge points like this are exactly where you get complicated, layered, unpredictable seismicity. Not one clean fault mechanism, but multiple systems stacked on top of each other, all storing stress in slightly different ways. This isn't a region that occasionally has earthquakes. This is one of the most seismically active patches of ground on Earth. Fiordland alone has produced some of New Zealand's largest earthquakes in the past few decades. In August 2003, a magnitude 7.2 earthquake ruptured in this exact area. In July 2009, a magnitude 7.8 struck at Dusky Sound, one of the largest earthquakes recorded in New Zealand in modern instrumental history, and it triggered a localized tsunami along the fjord coastline. These are not ancient historical footnotes. These are events well within living memory, produced by the same subduction interface that just released a 5.9 this week. Now let's talk about depth, because I want you to understand why this earthquake, despite being a moderate 5.9 on paper, still got the attention of every seismologist watching the region. The rupture occurred at roughly 76 kilometers below the surface. That's deep. And normally, deep earthquakes are actually less dangerous at the surface than shallow ones because more rock and crust sits between the rupture and the buildings above it, absorbing and dispersing the energy before it arrives. A magnitude 5.9 at 10 kilometers depth directly under a city is a very different and generally far more destructive event than a 5.9 at 76 kilometers depth under sparsely populated mountains. That's part of why we saw a wide area shaking felt across the lower South Island without significant structural damage being reported. The depth worked in New Zealand's favor here. But here's the part I need you to actually sit with, because this is where the story stops being about a single earthquake and starts being about a pattern. Depth working in your favor once does not mean it works in your favor every time. The Poisagur subduction zone is capable of producing both deep interplate ruptures like this one and much shallower, much more dangerous megathrust-style events along the plate interface itself, the kind of rupture mechanism that produces violent shaking and localized tsunamis, exactly like Dusky Sound in 2009. A 5.9 releasing energy at 76 kilometers depth is a very different animal from what this same subduction zone is fundamentally capable of generating if stress releases closer to the surface along the plate boundary itself. And this is exactly why GeoNet doesn't treat these events as isolated. New Zealand's National Seismic Hazard Model already identifies Fiordland and the surrounding Poisagur Alpine Fault junction as one of the highest hazard zones in the entire country. Every moderate earthquake here gets logged, analyzed, and folded into an ongoing risk assessment because the region has demonstrated repeatedly that it can produce magnitude 7+ events with very little advance warning. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the fault system every New Zealand seismologist has been quietly worried about for years, the Alpine Fault itself. The Alpine Fault is one of the most well-studied and most alarming fault systems on the planet, precisely because scientists can read its history with unusual clarity. Using paleoseismology, digging trenches across the fault trace and dating layers of disturbed soil and vegetation debris from past ruptures, researchers have reconstructed roughly 8,000 years of rupture history along this fault. And what they found is remarkably consistent. The Alpine Fault ruptures in massive earthquakes, typically in the magnitude 7, 9 to 8, one range, roughly every 250 to 300 years on average. The last major rupture happened in 1717. Do the math with me for a second. That puts us well past 300 years since the last full rupture. New Zealand's GNS Science has publicly stated, based on this paleoseismic record, that there is roughly a 75% probability of the Alpine Fault rupturing in a magnitude 8+ earthquake within the next 50 years. Some models place the probability of it happening within the next several decades even higher. This is not fringe speculation. This is published peer-reviewed hazard science from the country's own geological survey. And when the Alpine Fault does go, the modeling isn't subtle about what happens next. GNS Science's AF8 project, Alpine Fault Magnitude 8, is an entire multi-agency emergency planning framework built specifically around this scenario. The projections describe up to 4 minutes of continuous violent shaking across the South Island. Landslides are expected to block virtually every mountain pass connecting the west coast to the rest of the island, potentially isolating tens of thousands of people for days or weeks. Bridges, water systems, and power infrastructure across a huge swath of the South Island are expected to fail simultaneously. This is one of the most detailed pre-disaster planning efforts of its kind anywhere in the world, precisely because the people who study this fault know it is not a matter of if, but a narrowing window of when. So when a magnitude 5.9 fires off at the exact junction where the Puisagur subduction zone feeds into the southern end of the Alpine Fault, seismologists don't panic, but they absolutely pay close attention. Moderate earthquakes in this specific zone are being watched as part of the broader stress picture across the entire fault network, because this triple junction is one of the mechanisms researchers have flagged as a potential trigger point, a place where stress transferred from one fault system could, in theory, nudge another system that's already loaded close to failure. I want to be precise here, because I promised you no fear-mongering. There is no scientific evidence that this specific 5.9 earthquake increased the short-term probability of an Alpine Fault rupture in any measurable way that GeoNet or GNS Science has stated publicly. What I am telling you is that this event happened inside the most closely monitored, highest priority earthquake hazard zone in the entire country, and that context matters enormously for how seriously it's being treated by the people whose job is to watch this ground every single day. Let's zoom out for a second, because I think a lot of people hear earthquake in New Zealand and assume it's just background noise, the geological equivalent of rain in Seattle. And in a sense, you're not wrong. New Zealand sits directly on the boundary between the Australian and Pacific tectonic plates, and it experiences somewhere around 20,000 earthquakes every year, with roughly 150 to 200 of those large enough for people to actually feel. This is one of the most seismically active countries on Earth, full stop, but frequent and harmless are not the same word. And this is exactly the trap Venezuela fell into on a different fault system just weeks ago, when a country trained by decades of relative calm got hit by a rupture sequence far outside its recent memory. New Zealand does not have that excuse. This country knows precisely what its faults are capable of. The 2011 Christchurch earthquake, a mere magnitude 6. 2 on a previously unmapped fault killed 185 people and devastated the central city, because the rupture was shallow, close to the city, and struck a population that hadn't fully appreciated the risk sitting directly beneath their feet. New Zealand rebuilt its entire national approach to seismic risk assessment after that event, and Fiordland, the Alpine Fault, and the Puisagur subduction zone sit right at the top of the list of what keeps their scientists up at night. Here's the part where I want to give you something you can actually use, because information without action is just anxiety, and I don't want to leave you here just feeling unsettled. If you live anywhere along New Zealand's South Island, particularly near the Alpine Fault trace or along the fjord coastline, here's what the AF8 program and GeoNet actually recommend, and it applies whether you're a resident or someone with family there. Know your evacuation routes to higher ground if you're near the coast, because in a genuine subduction zone rupture, the earthquake itself is your tsunami warning. You will not have time to wait for an official alert. secure heavy furniture, water heaters, and anything that can fall on you, because in every earthquake fatality study, falling objects and structural collapse cause the overwhelming majority of injuries, not the ground movement itself. Build a household emergency kit that assumes you could be cut off from roads, power, and communication for at least a week, not a day, because that is literally what the Alpine Fault emergency plan is built around. And if you feel strong, prolonged shaking anywhere near the coast, don't wait for a phone alert. Move to high ground immediately. That's not me being dramatic. That is the official standing guidance from New Zealand's own civil defense agencies, built directly from the lessons of Dusky Sound in 2009 and Christchurch in 2011. Let's bring this back to the actual event that got us here today. A magnitude 5.9 earthquake, 76 kilometers deep, 42 kilometers northwest of Teanau. On its own, this was a moderate, deep earthquake that caused widespread shaking, but appears to have produced no significant damage and no confirmed injuries as officials continue their assessment. That is genuinely good news, and I don't want to bury that under all the context I just gave you. But this earthquake did not happen in a random, forgettable location. It happened directly inside the seismic engine room of New Zealand's South Island, at the junction of a subduction zone that has produced magnitude 7. 8 ruptures within the last 2 decades, sitting immediately adjacent to a fault system that is statistically overdue for one of the largest earthquakes this country will experience in centuries. Every moderate earthquake in this zone gets folded into the ongoing monitoring picture, because this is precisely the kind of region where the difference between "we felt some shaking" and "this is the big one" is not a matter of geological mystery. It's a matter of time, depth, and exactly which fault segment decides to let go next. New Zealand has spent years building one of the most sophisticated earthquake early warning and preparedness frameworks on the planet, precisely because this is the reality the country lives with permanently. That's the Japan lesson applied here. The ground is going to move. It has moved 20,000 times this year already, and it will move thousands more times before the year is out. What determines whether the next big one becomes a national tragedy or a manageable emergency isn't the magnitude number alone. It's whether the buildings, the evacuation plans, and the people themselves were actually ready when it arrived. I'll be tracking every aftershock coming out of this Fiordland sequence, and I'll be watching GeoNet's updates closely over the coming days to see whether this cluster settles down or continues. If you want those updates the moment they happen, subscribe now and drop a comment telling me if you've got family or friends anywhere in the South Island, because I want to hear directly from people who actually live with this fault system every day. Let's get this one to 5,000 likes so it reaches people who genuinely need to see it before the next shake comes. Stay safe out there, stay prepared, and I'll see you in the next one.